Billy had ran out of gas, leaving the Ducati drained dry of gasoline, after spending the night parked underneath the bridge that ran over top of the National River. He could see the high school from where he stood, looking down at it. All of the buses were there lined as if school was in session, but it wasn't anymore. He had not seen anyone outside in some time since the strange occurrences had started. He knew the school well and wondered if there might be some food still in the abandoned cafeteria. He had not eaten in some time, and his insides were lacking the nutrients. He had no energy left and suddenly decided to make a walk down and see. As he climbed down the small ramp just underneath the bridge where he had slept propped up against the barrier, using only a sweatshirt to protect himself from dehydration. It was really cold, but he knew the elements would even get worse. He thought about it, and he knew he could survive outside if he had to again. As he walked along the river, he took the ring of keys he had in his hand and tossed them as if he was throwing a baseball and watched it land and sink the second it hit. He was thinking of Tim as he walked even further away from the Ducati motorcycle. Reaching the school, he tried the front doors, but they were tightly locked and could tell the glass was thick and it would be hard to break. He knew that the shop windows were usually winded open on hotter months because when he was a student there, students in the shop would open them because there wasn't any air conditioning in the place. The auto mechanic shop was the hottest of all, at least in his opinion. Billy Jones was only in the shop for his final year there at Montgomery High. Before that, he was in masonry, but decided that working on cars would open up more of a future for himself. He had a great passion for classic hot rods and old Chevy Chevelles and daydreamed often about owning one by the time he graduated. Those dreams had erased and died off after his father committed suicide. He didn't care anymore about diamonds or roses. He wasn't going to dream big dreams or live for the later. He was going to settle for what it was, and what it was. But since he found that eagle the other day, he's been feeling much more confident in himself. In some odd way, inside he feels his life has a meaning. Much more meaning than he knew existed. Something powerful made him feel worthy of trying and fighting until he couldn't anymore, and nothing was going to set him back again. The windows were opened, as he guessed, but he would need to shatter it if he wanted to fit. They were smaller and much tighter than he remembered last. The grounds around the school didn't offer much, so he attempted to use his hands and pry the window up until it snaps, but it wasn't working. He grabbed the wall of bricks just underneath the framing of the old window in frustration, wanting to rip it apart in anger. As he tugged in it, frustration, one of the old bricks crumbled as it slid part way out. Luck had served him. His face turned into a slight smile as he took the broken brick out. Seconds later, the brick had done the job and he was now slithering himself into the slim window's opening. Billy then dropped into the room, planning first to get something to settle the pain he had. His gut was now rumbling and was growling in discomfort. He didn't bother with the shop he was in. As he paced his way into the hallway full of lockers, he kept moving until he could see the cafeteria. The floors were cold and damp from the drastic change of weather. Underneath all of the moisture, he could see that they were still the same tiles as before when he attended a couple years back. Old and lacking wax. Things seemed to never change there in Mansfield. They kept the town looking as old as it was. Making it to the large cooking area, he noticed the fridge. Where all the fridges were, they were near empty and everything else in the freezers were frozen hard. It seemed impossible to him. He needed something now and didn't have the patience to wait that long. Walking into the serving area, a few feet away, he could see the vending machines full of junk food, and one of them was hanging open for some odd reason. There was quarters laying along the floor as if somebody had dropped them, and there was a small trail of blood that seemed to be stepped in already. He could see the footprints as they went in two other directions, but didn't have time for it. He quickly grabbed a couple candy bars and a warm juice that was sitting inside of the open machine, which seemed to stop running way before he came in. His intuition was telling him to leave, but he decided to stay and sit down a bit at one of the long tables. Billy thought about Jimmy again, and realized he was now close by. Well, Jimmy's father's house was, not Jimmy. Jimmy wasn't anywhere in sight. Plus, he had never met him in person, only remembered him from the TV. He thought again about the strange boy running from Jimmy's house, wondering to himself if he went back, if he could talk to him. Then he thought of Mr. Blanche laying there dead as a doornail and covered in blood in the bathroom where he found him earlier. He wondered if the boy had done it, if he had caused those puncture holes. He opened one of the candy bar wrappers and took a bite, thinking about Mr. Blanche's shirt again, asking himself what could have made those kinds of wounds on his back. As Billy finished his drink, he went to get up and noticed he had felt something touch his sneaker underneath the table. Looking under, he could see a yearbook with a school symbol on the cover. It seemed to be brand new and had the student's name who left it inside the jacket. Billy's eyebrows raised as he was caught off guard, choking on his last sip of juice and thrown off by the name inside. Jimmy Blanche? The coincidence was too unlikely to him, but why was it there? He flipped through the pages as he sat back down, concentrating on the pictures inside. He came to Jimmy's picture and stopped, and could see that somebody had scribbled over his face with a black ink marker. They also wrote over his name, but it could still be read. Liar. And a number 2 was also written, but why? Billy wondered, sitting still while holding the book. Flipping some more, he came to another picture in the back where it had random photo shots of students. One of them was a group of kids in gym playing soccer, and another had the girls who were part of the choir singing in music class. The last one had a picture taken right there inside at the lunch tables. It showed a group of boys sitting together with food sticking out of their mouths, just playing around. The picture was that of 4 boys, but the one seemed to look angry and looked as if he was out of place. The boy was glaring at the other and was carrying some funky-looking satchel. He was kind of skinny and had a real pale complex. The boy didn't seem to look vibrant as the others. He also had glasses on that didn't make him look any more of a ladies' man. Billy remained concentrated on the boy, trying to think if he had seen that face before. He wasn't sure. Just as he was about to close it, he noticed the typing above the picture. It was small, and he had almost passed it. Reading them in his head, Jesse, Paul, Jimmy, and Brian. Billy then realized he had seen the boy, pointing his index finger on the second one, in which was Paul. Sitting there for a second, magnifying his brain around the boy's face, he closed the book, taking in the picture as if it were a movie reel now injected into his brain. Chapter 22, Death Melting. Lily got into her Ford pickup truck after hearing the alarming news of the plane crash. She wondered if she would see Roger again at the pub in town as she pulled out from her parents' farm, wondering if Roger was still intoxicated from the day before. She had a request to ask him, but wanted to wait and see what he had to say. If he was still drunk, she didn't want him to be making a decision he would regret. She had an idea that had come to her in the night as she slept on her father's recliner. Driving along, she turned onto a street that led to the pub. It was Franklin Avenue. She could see the sun hitting the front end of her truck as she drove, but noticed it had an unusual shine as it reflected off. The reflection was something she had never seen and didn't have a word for it. It was as if the rays were being reflected not just from the sun, but from the sun to something in the way of the sun and back to earth. She began to think of the strange light as she pushed the gas, speeding through, but noticing a stoplight just ahead that had turned yellow. She slowed the Ford, rolling to the light as she came to a complete stop just before it. The stoplight had changed quickly to red now. She tried to stare into the sun, looking at it, but it was causing her to feel some sort of way. It seemed to be losing its warmth. The sun was still too bright for her to see past. The blinding light hit her squarely as she stared into it. Covering her eyes and face, she feared of damaging her eyesight as she fought to see it even harder. The burning sun was now as bright as it could be, but didn't seem to send heat back as it hit Earth. Lily sensed that her idea was much larger than what it seemed. As she sat there inside the truck, sitting at the light had turned green. She was still stuck watching the sun. Her body had become cold now as she sat at the light, but no other cars were driving or waiting for her to go again. She was frozen there. She could feel the coldness seeping through the heater vents as it took her in its control. She could feel it running through her as she tried to escape from the cab of the idling truck. One of her legs was on the brake and the other one was flat along the floor mat, but she couldn't feel her toes. She could still feel her arms, but they too were cold, but the coldness was rising into them now. The unimaginable coldness swift through, but was taking longer this time. Though Lily was under its attack, the murderous chill still hadn't reached its point of total possession. She could still see the veins in her arms as she held on to the driver wheel. They were turning darkish purple, and she could see as she watched the coldness as it was beginning to freeze them from the inside out. Struggling to regain herself, the door had swung open abruptly, and she was grabbed by a bearded man. He cut the seatbelt around her as it retracted back. Lifting her legs up, he carried her from the cab and onto the street. Lily was unable to speak. Fearing for her life, the man hovered above her but didn't say anything. He looked nervous and he was shaken. She wasn't sure what his intentions were as she lay under him, watching but unable to talk or move her mouth. The man left her laying there as he quickly ran into the nearest house just off from the street. She lay there trying to fight the cold that had quickly taken her mobility. She was already affected too far at this point. She could hear her truck still running but wasn't able to see it from where she lay anticipating. It seemed like hours to her since the man had left her there, abandoned on the street. A moment later, the bearded man who had ripped her from her driver's seat was back and had a heavy blanket with him. Lily lay there as he tossed it onto her. Quickly rolling her onto it from the street, he picked her up again in his large muscular arms. He held her tightly as he took her into the house. She could see other people grouped around the living room who were also wearing heavy blankets around themselves, and she even saw a tiny child there. He didn't put her in that room. As he clutched onto her in the blanket around her, he hurried into the next room ahead. He didn't stop there as he carried her towards the door to the left of the room. Getting inside the door, he put her down as he rushed to get her clothing off. She could hear water running but wasn't able to turn her head. It sounded like a shower faucet, and it was running and cranked on as she could hear the powerful water as it hit the bottom of the shower drain. She could see the steam circulating through as the water poured. The bearded man looked scared and was breathing heavy as he lifted her legs from her jeans, tossing her boots to the side of the room beside a tiny towel rack. He continued to quickly remove her top and the rest of her clothing, and he was starting to sweat badly along his forehead. Lily could see his eyes and that he was panicking to hurry her into the shower. She didn't know why, but she trusted the hairy man as he gripped her once again and laid her under the steaming water. The man continued to rub her arms and legs, hoping to warm her nude body, as if he knew something. He then left her under the faucet as he went to the closet a foot away. He took a woman's hairdryer from it and sat it along the floor beside the shower. As Lily lay inside the steamy water as it doused onto her desperate naked body, she could feel the coldness still as it had frozen most of her, but the water was working towards the infection. She could feel one of her pinky toes as she twitched it to see if she could move. The hairy-faced man, who she had never seen, was praying now on his knees and speaking in another language. She didn't know where he was from, but could tell he was religious and wanted to help her. The man was still praying in a small bathroom as the water hit Lily, as it sprayed down onto her face and curvy body. She could hear him from where she lay and could see him just enough that she could see him taking a black rosary beaded necklace from his shirt. He was holding it to his face and kissing it and mumbling as he prayed over Lily's things. The more he prayed and the more the water sliced into the coldness that held her, she could feel her body as it began to thaw. She lay there still as she started to tremble and was starting to shake uncontrollably as the warmth of the hot water sprung onto her and her skin, seeming to save her from what it was. The man had stopped worshipping his higher power and had stopped kissing the beaded necklace as he came to the shower. Lily was now holding her trembling legs and arms as if she was a naked ball of flesh. She was fighting hard to stay warm as the final bit of coldness exited her. The bearded man reached in, turning off the water, and signaled with his hands to sit, shaking them at her and pointing to the floor of the tiny room. She crawled out from the shower, naked as the man awaited her. He covered her yet again with a blanket, wrapping it around her slim body as tight as he could. His hands were still shaking as he picked up the hairdryer on the floor and plugged it in. Continued to blow the hot air into her long hair It was a knotted mess now, as he did his best to keep her from trembling. As her hair dried, she could see the man had saved her life, but couldn't understand why he did. Shortly after, the man could see she was no longer infected by the weird coldness, and he shook his hands again towards her and then pointed at her clothing as he left, leaving from the shower room. Lily was still in the tiny bathroom where the man had saved her. She looked into the mirror just above the sink and could see herself again. Her face was chapped and her skin around her lips had split from the severeness of the infection, but she was there and breathing and could control her own body. She was in someone else's house and didn't know where the man had went. Lily made her way back into the main room and into the first room where she had seen the little girl, along with the group of others. She was surprised as she came to the spot because the group of others were gone and so was the little girl who she had seen. She observed the room again, only noticing she was the only one there and that even the religious man that had helped her from the coldness was gone as well. She quickly glanced around, noticing to check the other rooms, but found nobody inside, which confused her. She almost felt like it had been a dream, but it wasn't. The man had saved her life, but where had he gone and where did the rest leave to? She walked around for another few minutes, searching the house of the man again. The large hairy man had seemed to vanish. Him, along with the others, were nowhere to be seen as she peeked into each room to find them empty. It was all very becoming faint to her now. She began to walk towards the first room where she first came in and could see something propped up on the mantel above an old smoky fireplace. The fireplace didn't seem to be in working order and was closed up behind piles of junk and boxes of all sizes. They were stacked and leaning in front of it. As she got closer to the uncertain object, it had her full attention. She could see it was a retro-looking camera. The design was outdated and the camera was scratched badly. She turned it on. The digital camera still had half of the battery charged, to her surprise. Lily scanned through the pictures but didn't see any of the unrevealed man or of the others. She then turned it off as she sat it back down. Lily was still facing the mantel as she turned around. Shockingly, she caught a glimpse of the man in the doorway. He was smiling at her as he waved briskly, but only once, turning around and leaving towards the outside. The door was open as the light shot in through the outside. It was brilliant and vibrant, the sunlight which was vividly colorful and stimulating Lily's senses as she could now smell the outside as it was before everything. She didn't have a chance to thank the man and wanted to as she ran after him, reaching the outside, but he had dematerialized into thin air. She was rapidly beginning to think the man and the other victims of the coldness were really non-physical souls or lost spirits who had already passed on. She could still see them as she perceived them earlier and would never forget them and the kind of character who had took her in. She could only imagine that they were there for her father as well, to help her and warn her, or warn others who possibly came along later desiring assistance. Chapter 23, Tasting Blood. Billy Jones was walking as he came upon a deserted tractor-trailer just along the narrow street. Its four-ways were still blinking, but he didn't see anyone nearby or inside from what he could see as he examined it. Running his eyes along the side as he walked closer to the cab, it read in bold dark red letters, Ender's Hauling Service. The trailer was white and the cab side was black and looked to be from the early 80s. Billy Jones had a positive mindset as he left the school. He was thinking critical and had his mind on the boy he had come to learn was Paul. Billy Jones knew that if he could find the boy, he might be able to shed some light on things. He knew after finding the yearbook that the boy was the same strange kid he had seen in his motorcycle headlight. He was walking briskly as he gained ground toward SHAWL Road. Walking moderately harder now as he calculated everything he had seen since the day before. Billy became surprised when he noticed the passenger side door was also ajar. He took a look inside as he stepped up onto the top of the step, reaching his head in. He could see a skull-shaped ashtray and that had been recently used. It had a tobacco pipe laying inside, but Billy didn't bother to take anything. He didn't smoke, although he had tried a cigarette once that his friend Tim had shared with him just after Billy's father passed away. It was a bad day after seeing his deceased body as it rested getting lowered at the funeral. The truck smelled of burned tobacco and had dropped cigarette ashes smeared into the upholstery. A set of dice hung from the rearview mirror as Billy touched them as he leaned further in. He had never been inside a diesel truck that large before. As he looked around for the button to turn off the lights blinking outside, he could also see a woman's high heel as it poked itself out from under the passenger side of the bench seat. The high heel shoe he could see was small, but not of a child. It had a cute purple flower with a white center in the middle. The shoe had sat alone and was petite and was purple also. It looked forgotten, he thought to himself. He looked once more but failed to find a way to shut the lights off outside. Giving up on a button, he stepped down from the large truck. Reaching the street as his legs lightly landed on a small crack along the surface, he could see the ancient road was lacking and needed to be paved. He then walked around to the rear side of the diesel truck, reaching the back of the trailer that was attached to it. The back doors were locked as he tugged to get them open. They had some kind of special pin in place holding them. He noticed the two large doors were starting to ice over as he turned from them and peered into the sky, noticing the sun was still up. His hands were colder now as he put them to his face, blowing into them, forming a bowl with his hands as he attached his fingers together to hold a hot breath of air. Then he began rubbing them using the friction to keep them warm. Billy Jones stood silently, tucking his hands into his jeans. He was feeling the air getting colder and the sweater he had on wasn't holding much heat. As he stood there by the back bumper of the large truck, he used his hands to spy out into the woods. He couldn't see through the heavy brush but wanted to take a shortcut toward SHAWL Road. He knew that if he followed them and kept in the right direction, it would save valuable time getting there. Billy knew the relentless cold wasn't going to surrender. The coldness he felt followed no code of conduct and seemed to never back down. Billy knew there was more to it. He would also fight to the end and never reluctantly throw in the towel, admitting defeat to the coldness that seemed to have a life of its own. Billy began sprinting into the icy edge of the heavy brush, which made getting to SHAWL Road difficult. It wouldn't be easy as he took a look around to get a visual of where he was heading. As he came to a small path, which looked to be man-made, he could see some debris up ahead along the side of the matted grass. He slowed quickly as he stopped in his tracks, feeling shocked and disturbed by the grisly scene just inches from him. A mutilated body of a naked woman who was brutally slaughtered there was laying tangled in a mess of her own clothing and her own remains. Billy instantly puked onto the frozen grass, leaning towards the side of the trail. He didn't want to see the horrible, gruesome sight of the torn woman. Her clothes had been removed from her body and were slumped over in an awkward position. That's when he looked again out of pure curiosity. The woman was young, maybe in her 20s, and she was pretty. She was mutilated badly and covered in her own blood. Her shirt had been ripped clean from her and hung from a nearby tree branch. Her jeans were nearly shredded. Only one of her pants legs were still on her. The other one was completely in pieces along the cold ground. That's when he noticed she was wearing one high heel, and remembered seeing the one laying in the truck. Her foot was angled upwards, missing the heel. Her sock was drenched with blood. It looked as if she was hit with a blunt object. The rest of her body was twisted, leaving both of her arms hanging in an unpleasant position. He felt it in his chest that something terrible had happened to her. He could see the nightmare rolling through his head as he imagined her attacker. He couldn't grasp his mind around it all. Why? He wondered as he looked around, making sure he was alone. Her hair was long and dark brown, but now leaves and bugs were in it. They were making some nest there now. Her eyes were closed, which led him to believe she died slow and painful as he looked again, thinking about Mansfield and what it has become. He suddenly heard a noise coming from within the heavy brush of leaves, vines, and tree roots. It sounded like somebody was stepping on some crisp leaves along the surface. He could feel his heart drop in sheer panic, wondering if somebody was hiding there and secretly watching him. Billy was in abrupt terror, and he stood there in silence looking around. His adrenaline had taken over him as he turned back towards the direction he was originally going. Running with his heart pounding at an alarming rate, he jumped over the small icy patched mound, hoping to make it to the road. Running even harder as he hit against some branches covered in frost. The frigid cold was causing him to slow as it hit him, causing his muscles to stiff. Turning back as he ran, he screwed his eyes backwards to see if he was being followed by anyone. He didn't detect anything or anyone as he came to the road. He didn't hear the sound anymore, and Shaw Road was still deserted as the day before. Chapter 24, The Long Walk Alone. Leaving the house, she noticed her truck had stopped running as it sat still in the center of the silent road. It didn't seem to be tampered with or touched in any way. She could only hear the absence of noise. She didn't see any other cars or vehicles on the road either. Lily crawled up into her pickup truck, sitting down on the seat as she cranked the key. The key was still lodged in the ignition as Lily attempted to start it. The truck key had been untouched as well. The other batch of keys were dangling from her keychain as she pumped the gas, hoping it would start up. The truck didn't turn over, making a strange sound as the engine backfired and smoke began rising up from the front hood of it. She tried again and it wouldn't do anything. Suddenly a bright light began to flash along the cluster of the dashboard. It read "Low Oil." In bright orange letters, she knew then that it was going to be a long walk for her as she grabbed the keys from the truck, deserting it there. Lily was angry and stomping her feet against the street. Cursing out loud, she continued to walk away from her most beloved possession. He had the Ford a long while, and it used to be her father's. He gave it to her after she started working at the coffee shop in town, and it was the first will she had ever had since getting her license. This angered her, but there was no time to waste. The days were becoming colder and darker much sooner. It had been a long walk in the cold as Lily made her way to find Roger. Almost an hour had passed and she approached Dilfer Street. Dilfer Street was only a block from the watering hole where she spent evenings there with her father after horse races. Her mother stayed home when they did that. She would bake homemade apple pies for them for when they gotten back. Her mother knew how special the father and daughter time was for them both, and didn't care for the bar scene. She was brought up Catholic and still carried a lot of the beliefs, but didn't take it out on the two. Lily Jean arrived in town at the spot she knew best. The pub was still open, although less people were inside that day. She didn't see Roger either as she walked towards the empty bar stool. She took a look around as she waited for a drink and noticed a neon sign that was facing outwards in the small window. The sign was blinking and making a funny odd sound as if it were ready to short out. She looked around again, this time more swiftly, as she sat waiting for the bartender to make her rounds. She could see nothing was different there. Nobody seemed to be talking and it was dead quiet inside. Where they sat, they were hushed, noiseless, and just sitting still. Lily felt worried. Had the cold gotten to them? She hadn't seen the bartender either since she arrived. She figured she was in with the cook then. But now she had second thoughts now. She got up from her stool and scurried towards the kitchen area where they served food. She walked in through the swinging door as it swung back and forth. Planted her feet in, almost catching herself. The bartender she knew as Andrea wasn't there. They only had 2 regular bartenders and Andrea mainly worked that shift. Lily didn't see anyone else inside, only the dishes piled up near the washer that weren't washed and still had food clung to them. The dishwasher was still running and there was water pouring out from it as it splashed around. She didn't look any further as she turned to leave. Before Lily left, she tried the phone by the bar. It was cut off and didn't seem to have any power. It was useless to her as she dropped the receiver onto the bar. She spotted a reusable metal lighter along the bar top just beside the stretched out receiver she had just discarded a split second before. The tiny metal lighter had a small stamp along the bottom of it reading Zippo. There was a bald eagle's face along the front of it, along with the American flag. She took a shining to it as she put it in her pocket of her blue hoodie. Lily then stood there playing with her hair a moment for a dull moment, just thinking of herself, wondering if Roger was at home and if he was all right. She continued curling her soft brown hair in it between her fingers before sitting. The customers were still frozen there in their seats just feet behind her. They were at the tables behind her and the tables to the side of her, but she kept her eyes ahead. She began to feel hopeless as she sat back down into the stool. The jukebox was still playing an old Elvis record as she thought about her limited choices. She didn't have a car and she didn't have anyone but herself. Also, Lily realized that it would be dark soon and didn't know if walking again would be very smart. She was wearing a thin hooded sweatshirt and jeans, but outside it was getting chillier and more dangerous. She could hear the wind picking up outside as she sat watching the window again. Suddenly a paper bag came smashing against the window and stuck to it as the harsh wind held it there in its strong hold. She jumped. As it caught her in surprise, she didn't expect it, still watching as the brown paper bag hung in desperation. She could hear the wind smacking it even harder as it tore a little, surviving the blow. Lily just sat there gawking at the forcefulness of the summer wind that had turned into a deadly, unexplainable coldness. She lost interest as she turned in her stool to see the frozen customers still sitting in the room. It seemed like a horror film, and as if she was the main character starring in it. Her only hope now was that the ending was not a bad one. There was liquor bottles standing up just feet away from her behind the bar. She sat in total silence. She could see them. She gave it a quick thought, barely hesitating as she got up from the stool and went around to get them. She ran her fingers across them as she checked them out, looking for her favorite nightcap. It wasn't there, so she settled for a bottle of Jack Daniels that was more than 3/3 full. She observed the bottle as she carried it back to where she was sitting. Not that it mattered, nobody else was coming in or moving around. She thought the thought of that was kinda humorous, but in the back of her mind it was more twisted than anything. She opened the top of the alcohol as it hit her nose. The smell of it reminded her of her father. It was his favorite brand and he drank the same kind when they would come out celebrating her wins after a race. Lily Jean didn't bother for a glass, quickly putting her head back as the Jack ran into her chapped face. She hadn't drank anything hard in a long while. She was drained over the walk, but damn did the taste of that Jack satisfy her. The music box was still shoving out music. It was preloaded with different music that would play until you fed dollars and quarters into it. The song that had come on caught Lily and made her think. The song was playing softly as it played out, spreading through the room as it came through the speakers above. As she thought about her mother and father, the very song had played that day they were married. Not that Lily was even there, she hadn't been born yet. Her mother had told her about it and had told her the song was very special to them. It was by the Clovers. Love Potion number 9. It rung into her head as her eyes closed for a second, thinking about the story she remembered. Lily continued sipping from the bottle as her head drooped down a bit. She was feeling buzzed and her body was slipping into relaxation. Chapter 25, Eye of the Devil. In a split instance, a sudden unforeseen object had unexpectedly smashed through the window where the sign once sat blinking, sending the sign flying by her as the sharpened shards of sharp glass hit her in her side. She quickly awoke from the daydream, confused and frantic, not knowing what had just happened. Freezing air started pouring in from the openness that the object had left. It was now on the floor, peeking out into the nightfall. She could see a light strobe as it flashed intermittently from outside and into the tiny pub. She couldn't see what it was as she lowered herself onto her belly now as her chest began to pound in terror. Crawling quietly towards the kitchen of the pub, she hesitated for a moment as the glass below her started to pop and crumble. Her hand was bleeding from the glass below as she lifted her head to see outside, but all she could see was the flashing strobe. She began again slithering to the swinging double doors, trying hard not to be seen, still peeking back as she worked her way to them, reaching them finally as she stooped underneath them. Stopping, she slowly began prying the doors apart as silent as she could. She lay below both of the closed doors as they slowly came open. She noticed her hands were now bleeding from the strenuous crawl. A deep gust of cold wind flung in like a bat out of hell. Its force was uncontrollably furious and deathly as it struck the bottle of Jack Lily had left, sending it down onto the floor, smashing into tiny diamond-like pieces as they scattered out, sparkling under the lights inside the pub. A little alcohol in it went and had splashed across the bar in front of it. Lily Jean found her feet just inside the kitchen doors, standing up, shielding herself with the swinging doors so that nothing could see her there. She was breathing heavy and was shaken by the loudness of the crash the window had caused. She stayed put behind the doors, silent and watching towards the darkness of the night in the open window. Suddenly, a PA system sounded from within the outside, sending Lily's heart into suspense mode as she screamed towards the broken window. "Hey, it's me, Lily Jean!" Thinking for a second, thinking that it was maybe a police officer. She watched the lights circle as they shine in through the pub from the outside, waiting for a response but received nothing. She could see tiny pieces of jagged glass sticking out from the window, still intact. A second later, the PA system sounded again and clicked off, sending static out into the night. The PA system sounded once more as if somebody was playing with the button. It clicked then, again. "Come out with your hands up, or we will be forced to come in and shoot you dead," said, sounding deep, like an older man's voice. Lily Jean could feel the pressure in her body. She wanted to say something, but her instincts were telling her to stay inside and not make any noises. The man on the PA didn't sound like any of the town's officers she had ever come across before. She knew most of them. It was a friendly town there in Mansfield before the strange coldness. The PA sounded once more, and more roaring and thunderous this time. He backed away and into the tiny pub kitchen. "Okay then. No more warnings, your time's up. Ready yourself for a horrific and heinous death." Ha 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 ha! Just then, the PA cut off, and the strobes that were outside the window had stopped flashing. The thought of it all was unspeakable to Lily. She was scared and trembling and could feel herself. Her undergarments were wet. The terror had made her loose, every muscle leaving her and mind running away in terror. She hastily ran over to where the dishes were piled, grabbing a sharp butcher knife as she slid it out from under a dirty pan. Her nerves were jumping and a sickness covered her insides like she was about to regurgitate the Jack Daniels she had a few minutes earlier. She tried to keep her mind from it by closing her eyes just for a second. It had worked. Her stomach was still in knots, but she had to think quickly what to do in case he came inside. It had hit her. Her idea was risky, but what else could she do? There wasn't any way to escape the tiny kitchen. It had no windows or back entrances. She swiftly went over to the stove area where she turned the gas on, bringing a large flame flying up from the stovetop's burner. She took a deep breath in, releasing it towards the scalding flames, dampening them out. Then she continued to blow the pilot light out as well. Gas quickly started streaming from it, sending poisonous vapors into the air. Making sure her plan was foolproof, she checked to make sure the knobs were turned to its highest point, and they were. Suddenly, the door creaked towards the front of the pub. She knew it was whoever had been on the PA system. The door closed as she could hear the sound of it springing back into place. It was one of those spring-loaded doors, made from an old piece of pine. Seconds had passed and no more sound as she stayed quiet in the kitchen listening. She could hear a sound of the man flicking the flint on his lighter. He was having trouble getting at the spark. He soon gave up as he stood in the doorway. Lily Jean didn't know what he was doing. She couldn't see him from where he was, or where she was. She just knew he was there. Her heart was still racing as she held her chest in silence. Again, the footsteps started inwards. She could hear the sound of his heavy feet. The sound sounded of broken glass under giant boots, she thought. Lily dashed towards the cabinets under the large pantry, crawling in and hiding herself within the darkness of the small space. She was overwhelmed with extreme motion. Her eyes were watering as she held back from tearing. A tiny crevice of light shined in from the kitchen as it landed on her, hiding her face as she peeked cautiously, awaiting the footsteps coming. The nook was the only place she could find to hide as she watched from a narrow opening. The distinctive odor of gas was making it hard for her to breathe as she fought it back by putting her arms of her hooded sweatshirt over her mouth. Trying not to cough, she masked her face the best she could, hoping not to pass out from the fumes. Immediately, she could hear them walking her way and heard the double doors of the kitchen swing wildly open as they rocked back and forth until they stopped. The steps had ceased again, as she could see through the tiny slit. She could see from the legs down somebody wearing dark army pants. They had many pockets, as she stared, hoping they wouldn't see her inside her hiding spot. She could see the tip of a barrel as he neared, but his face and upper body was still cut off. She could see his black combat-style boots as he turned the other way back towards the double doors. She opened the cabinet door just enough to see the back of him. His hair was curly and dark, and he had a strap along his shoulder attaching a semi-automatic rifle along his back. The thing that worried her the most was the machete he was holding. It had a long piercing blade that was razor-edged. The light reflected from it, hitting the ground, giving Lily the notion of a horrendous death awaiting her. Somehow, by good fortune, the stranger wearing army pants hadn't smelled the gas. It was pure luck. Lily could still see him as she crawled part way from the tiny area, seeing the man as he turned in a circle observing the pub. Didn't say anything as he looked around. Lily was sure he had heard her scream just a few minutes earlier. She could now see his face and his long bushy mustache. He also had on an army vest and other miscellaneous military supplies. He looked suitable for war if one was to break out. He wore a cigarette behind his left ear as well. Must have been the one he tried to light as he came in, she thought. She could see him just outside the bar area near the tables and chairs. He was searching a frozen man's body. As he reached into it, she could see him turning the man's shirt pocket inside out. His ignorance was disgraceful, and she could barely believe her eyes as he continued. He was snatching anything he could get his hands onto. The icy man had been iced over and utterly gone for some time. Coldness had expired him as the utterly deranged man from outside began to talk to the deceased corpse. What? No cigs? No money? Disturbingly laughing, facing the lifeless man who was already out and out. Lily was still in the kitchen behind the doors once again, waiting for her chance. The gas was building up and filling quickly. She could see he was near the back of the dining area now. She could hear him saying something from in the distance, but it was muffled. Then he spoke again. I could have sworn I heard one of you open your fat mouths. He then circled around the tables full of lifeless bodies, as if looking for more things to swipe. Chapter 26. Looting. The long-mustached maniac continued to tread as he patrolled the area around the bodies. Lily peered at him, watching the man in army threads. He stood there for a second. He was inches from one of the bodies as it sat there lifeless, with a cold mug of freshly poured beer in front of him. Lily recognized the stiff corpse. He lived nearby. He was one of the old-timers that had been a regular there. She acknowledged seeing him there many times, and her father knew him for years, but that was when he was still alive. Suddenly, the unstable man in the army getup tossed the lifeless body of the old-timer onto the floor, sending his hard body crashing as it flattened out. He searched him again, turning the body over with one free hand, holding the blade in the other. The man was callous. He didn't seem to feel anything, continuing to rip his back pants pockets outwards from the dead man on the floor. Lily was in total shock as she watched him. The heartless man eagerly checked for fresh cigarettes, smoke, and loose money. She quickly moved as she smoothly got onto her stomach, her tiny fingers and hands still freshly cut and bleeding from the broken glass laying from under her, slithered back through the double doors, hurrying to get to the main entrance of the pub. The irregular man, who to her was pitiless and hardened, began tugging on the pants of the frozen corpse as he tucked the stolen things into his army jeans. She could see him as she made her way along the floor, a few short feet away, blocking his view of her with the tables and chairs. He was still putting his newly found treasures into his army jacket under his vest. The heartless man started talking again, now standing at another deceased body in front of him, still unaware of Lily being there. Thank you for your generosity and your kind donation, he said as he laughed cowardly. He tucked the guy's last empty pocket back into his pants. The frozen victim sat there stiff, just facing forward as if he were sleeping. His wife was frozen beside him and had her arm around him, but she was gone as well. The apathetic man suddenly swatted the dead man with the palm of his hand as if to pat his back, but in that instant the sitting man's frozen face flew forward, bluntly bouncing off the tabletop. The dead man lay there motionless and face down. Sitting beside his wife, the cruel man from outside peered down at him, thinking for a moment as he itched the back of his head. He then looked to the man's wife beside him. Ma'am, I think your husband had too much to drink. I think it's time we flag his ass, he said jokingly, sounding cold but in a humorous way. The deranged man stood there in his army gear, but hadn't turned around yet to see Lily making her way to the door. In desperation, she made it to the front entrance, quickly raising up onto her feet, watching the heartless thing in front of her. To her, he wasn't a man. He was worse. There was only one word she could think of at the time, and that was thing. He was finished looting the dead now as he turned unknowingly towards her, as surprised as she was. He hadn't reacted, but his eyes widened as he clutched onto his machete. Lily stood knowing the gas was coming in through the double doors and knew it wouldn't be long for them. He just then seemed to take notice of the gas as he looked towards her in total loss. Peering at her in pure anger, she was still facing him, still in a short distance, his pointed machete in his hand, vibrating as his hand shook in total hatred towards her. To Lily it seemed as if everything going on was slowing. Every movement was as if she could see it before it occurred. It was very strange. Lily's one hand was in her hooded shirt as the man unleashed towards her, running uncontrollably in his icy boots. Lily stepped back to avoid his charge, knowing the cost of living would be him or her. It now seemed as if time had flicked itself on and the picture was now on hyperspeed as he rushed towards her in the entrance. The darkness was behind her as she stood preparing herself, flicking the lighter open as it lit simultaneously as she slid it across the floor at him. Everything went black. The pub, the watering hole, the existence of the old-timers would now be lost in the town's history. The air was black and rose into the night, now a burning inferno, raging hot as steep as New York City skyscrapers. The results of the coldness was still churning, leaving even more aftermath than the last as it spread from each place. Chapter 27, Cold Sweat Back. Billy jogged along the frosted street. He could see he was closer now than he anticipated. He finally reached SHAWL Road where the streets interconnected. Gaining momentum as he ran past a bunch of parked cars, his hands began to hurt from the frigid coldness. He could now see his breath rising from in front of him. His lungs were now hurting as he fought the air, scurrying in a great haste toward Jimmy's parents' house. He was cold and his body ached even worse than earlier. The sun was up, but he couldn't feel anything but his hands burning from the severe coldness in the air. He could see a red car parked up ahead at the bottom of a lane. He delivered papers there, but never had a personal encounter with a resident. He could barely feel his legs as the cold worked its way against him. He stopped for a second as he stood on the street watching the red car. His sweater was wet and dampened in sweat, and he couldn't take another minute wearing it. Walking towards the car now, parked facing the house in front of it, the lane was on a hill and the house was sitting on top. Billy was shaken now and badly as he couldn't keep himself from feeling desperate to warm himself. He approached the four-door vehicle, opening the back passenger side door, hoping to find something to cover himself. The car was picked clean and only had a small child's car seat placed there in the back seat. A stuffed teddy bear lay beside it, half frozen. Billy decided to get inside as he sat on the other side, scooching himself into the empty space. He fought the cold, rubbing his arms and legs and blowing the only hot air he could produce from his mouth into his hands. Sitting there on the other side, beside the tiny car seat, he watched from the window. It had been covered over in a thin layer of ice. He could see the sky was whitening and the air was moving much quicker. Deep in his mind, he thought about the two boys that had went missing, wondering if they too were also suffering in the coldness. He then remembered he had seen it in the movies. Maybe this was one of those movies he had been thinking about in the car. And if there was a set of extra keys laying around inside, he leaned over between the bucket seats, eagerly to get to the driver's seat. Making it into the seat, it was cold. Sitting down, he could feel its coldness burn into his legs as he fixed them in front of the pedals. He was losing body heat and fast as he scrummaged looking for the keys. His hopes were high that very second, but how long would it last? The glove box was empty and full of insurance papers and expired registrations, so he closed it quickly. Thinking harder, he sat there adjusting the mirror to see behind himself as he sat there in the seat. Nobody was around, and the owners didn't seem to see him either. Then he remembered that people sometimes put extra keys up inside the sun visor. Hurrying, he checked as he flipped it downwards to see. His eyes brightened, surprised as he took the single key out from behind the elastic strap it held it. He noticed that the key was small, much more slim than the actual starter key. It wasn't going to fit the ignition, he knew that, but knew it had a purpose. The key was in his hand as he looked around. The glove box compartment didn't use a key, so it had to be for something else. Billy thought in desperation as he grabbed the door handle, swinging it open as the insides of it popped. He was outside now as he hurried to the back of the car. sticking the slim key into the trunk latch. It seemed to fit perfectly. He turned it as the trunk lifted. He peered towards it as the shocks came to a quick halt, leaving the trunk lid raised open in front of him. He could see a suitcase inside laying that had a brass handle and a car jack and a tire underneath that was useless to him. He took the case, leaving everything else in the trunk. As he slammed the lid shut, pacing back to the side of the car, he opened the back passenger side as he sat anxiously there, pulling the door shut until it closed him in. The suitcase was tin and had latches holding it shut, but didn't seem to be locked. Billy was hoping as he held it that it would be his relief if he could find something warmer to wear than the wet sweater he had on, drenched in his sweat. He unlatched it, not wanting to wait any longer as his body trembled in the cold back seat. He noticed a tiny button along the top underneath the brass handle. As he pressed it, it came open in his arms. Billy smiled. A nicely folded outfit lay inside. Reaching into the open suitcase, he pulled a striped shirt with long sleeves out from within it. It wasn't a sweater, but it would help. As he tossed it up over his head, covering his wet sweater, he needed all the layers he could get at that point. He looked back down into the case where he spotted another article of fabric that rested under the shirt. It was another long-sleeve shirt, but this one had buttons and a collar on the neck. He didn't wait, rushing fast as he tossed it up over the striped one, instantly feeling a little better, not completely, but he had found his relief, and that's all that mattered at this point to Billy. Out of glee and anger, he had felt the hope he desperately needed, punching the headrest hard in front of himself as he laughed. He had overcome the odds that very minute, and it felt good. Chapter 28, Waking Up, Shaw Road. She could feel somebody's hands touching her. Her eyes were still shut. In pain, she lay there. She didn't know where, but she was alive. Suddenly, she felt something make contact with her forehead. It was cold and felt wet. She wanted to open her eyes, but waited for a second, still having the cold-blooded, merciless man in her thoughts. She stayed still, hoping it wasn't him. She didn't remember what had happened, though. She could only remember seeing him digging through the dead's belongings. She could feel the bed underneath her. What bed? She didn't know. But it was a bed. She could hear the springs creaking as she lay there with her eyes in total darkness. She could hear somebody in the room. She heard the sound of dripping water and a sound of a tin bucket across from her. She began to open her eyes. Then again the feeling on her forehead started. She paused, clenching them even tighter. Then suddenly a voice. "Girl, you're lucky I came along when I did." She acknowledged the voice right away. It was Roger. "Roger Goodens?" Lily opened her eyes, feeling relieved and very grateful as she cracked a half-attempted smile towards him. Her body was hurting. The pain running through her was agonizing. Her arms were the worst of all. Lily's arms were scorched and seared from the explosion. They looked and felt terrible. Her face was bandaged along her hairline, but she could see. Roger must have found her. She was touched by it, knowing she had never given him a shot growing up. Roger was sitting in a wooden chair just to the side of her, where she rested trying to recover from the blast. Roger continued to douse her with a wet rag. He was trying to keep her from getting another fever. She wanted to thank him, but she was sore and needed to recharge. She closed her eyes again, knowing Roger was there to protect her. "Missy, I don't know what I would have done if I found you any worse," he said, sounding serious and sincere. Lily lay there but didn't say a word, knowing Roger understood. She could hear him in the chair as the wooden pegs screeched into the floor every time he leaned over her with the cold wet rag. She'd never seen this side of Roger. It was comforting to her. She appreciated the great consolation he aided her with, as she listened to him as she lay sunken in the bed. Lily had been there once at Roger's house, but had never been in that room. It was quiet there, and that helped as she thought to herself, wondering how long she'd be there. She knew that burns like the one she had took time to heal. Her injuries would take valuable time, but if she wanted to be healthy again, she would have to take it easy now. Outside was cold, almost freezing temperatures now. The sun was dying, although it stood above the town. The coldness had geared up, taking control of the town's people. The strange chill had come from the ripped dimension in the space above. Right above the town, the mass, whatever it was letting the whole town become something of ungodly words. The flatlands were now huge sheets of frozen ice, and the crops were dying almost as fast as the town's residents. There was no escape, and if there was, how could it be found? The residents there were oblivious and under its strong hold. There was a villainous dimension that had opened there, and opened its wicked wings like the devil himself. It possessed the weaker ones first, and then the stronger ones last. The sinful creatures were strange beings that could only be understood on their own planet. There was no understanding them there. They had settled there in Mansfield and had kept itself busy by killing. For how long, no one knew. The monstrous monstrosities were foul and a stench of pure evil. They were now taken over, and even some were able to stay unseen. The immoral beasts could hide themselves inside of the dimension there in Mansfield. The distant dimension wasn't visible to the naked eye. It was many universes away, but yet it was there and killing the town. It rotted the town from the inside out. Chapter 29, The Finding, Takedown. It was late in the afternoon now as Billy Jones made it to Jimmy's father's house. He was warmer now under the shirts he had found in the trunk of the car. Stepping into the frozen driveway, he peeked up at the second level of the house. He didn't see anyone, but sensed that he was being watched. He could see Jimmy's dad's car still there on top of the drive. Walking slowly not to slip on the icy ground, he made it to the front door. Jimmy suddenly heard distinct sound. It was a chopping sound. He could hear it coming from across the way, but couldn't pinpoint it at all. He turned away from the Blanch's house as he glued his eyes towards where he had heard it. He waited, but the sound didn't happen. He was muddled. As he stood there, he put his hands into his pockets of his cargoes. Inside, he could feel the tiny eagle. He held it in his fist, but left it inside as he peeked around out towards the woods across from the Blanches. He took a step outwards towards the woods, listening as hard as he could, but yet again nothing. He didn't understand it. He had just heard something, and it was as if it was just in his mind. He was utterly confused as he crouched down as he sat along the edge of the deck, peering at the house across the way. That's when he heard it again. He bolted towards the sound, not knowing what to expect. He figured finding somebody was better than not. As he ran, he felt prominent of the thought. Swiftly running towards the house by the woods, he could begin to see somebody swinging a large-handled axe into a woodstack, as if cutting firewood. The boy was struggling as he lifted it, but seemed determined as he struck into it, splitting the piece of wood into two halves. The boy was just a short distance away and just outside the wild brush. Only a few yards away he could see him. It was, as he ran stuttering in his own complacent thoughts, it was the boy he had seen in the yearbook back at Montgomery High School. Billy called out to him, "Hey, But before he could finish himself, Paul had darted into the woods, dropping the axe along the frosty ground. It was Paul, he thought as he ran after him, running into the impenetrable part of the woods, chasing after him. His heart was pounding and his legs were burning, and he had been on his feet all day, and now this, Billy thought. He pursued Paul on foot. He could see him running with that satchel. He had seen him with the same one before. Billy could barely keep his feet from sliding as he gripped the icy land, taking big strides, trying to catch Paul. He screamed, hoping Paul would hear him. "I'll catch you sooner or later, you little asshole." But Paul kept going, jumping through even thicker parts of the woods, passing through it as if he had done it a million times before. Billy did everything he could to catch up, but was still yards from him. He could see Paul, but he wasn't slowing any until suddenly he slipped. A patch of frozen ice, he slid face first, rolling in an awkward way as his body came to a stop. Billy leaped onto him, wrapping his arms around Paul's legs to keep him from getting away. His arms were on him tight as Paul fell again, trying to pry himself from him. But the run was short-lived. Paul was still trying to unleash as Billy had him pinned to the cold surface, apprehending him by tucking both of Paul's arms behind his back as he lay facing the weathered ground. Billy could see Paul had dropped the satchel just a foot away in the snow. It happened so quick. Must have been when he slipped. Billy wondered what it was that made Paul run away, as he struggled to keep Paul from squirming out. "Look, I don't want to hurt you, kid. I just want to talk to you," Billy said as he fought him from twisting away. The boy was fidgety and was trying hard to get up. Billy could see he wanted the bag. Whatever the strange, unusual satchel seemed to wrench the boy's mind as he cussed and shouted, "You're going to fucking pay. You hear me? They are here for you," screaming out towards him. Billy continued to hold him down into the heavy brush until he could calm. Paul screamed again, trying to kick away from Billy, but his kicks were ineffective. He wouldn't seize as he fought to break loose. Billy slipped into the icy ground, his feet dug deep, trying to keep a hold of Paul. Billy moved his grip, trying to get him wrapped in, but more effective. He went for Paul's head to clench him in a headlock as Paul broke from him, freeing himself and ran to make his getaway. He jumped for the satchel, barely sliding into a tree in front of him, as Billy caught him and tussled him down again. As the two wrestled each other along the hard frosted ground of leaves and other debris, Billy could see Paul was seething and almost foaming from the mouth in extreme trepidation. His anxiety was growing irate. Billy could barely hold on him now. Wet leaves began to fly as the two kicked and held on to each other, but Billy wouldn't give him the opportunity this time. There was no way. He needed to see what Paul had in that satchel. Billy held him as the two rolled once more into a large pile of roots and vines along an ice-covered bush. He looked from the corner of his eye and could see a heavy stick that had been unearthed during their struggle. He reached to get it as his arms overstretched. Paul was still hitting him, but his punches were weak. Still brawling, Billy held tightly to Paul's neck, reaching for the loose limb that had dug its way up. Losing his vitality, he finally gripped it snug into his right hand, wrapping his fingers hard against the wood. Suddenly he swung it into Paul, punishing him as it connected into his chin. A piece of birchwood split, ricocheting into the brush ahead and came down, landing in the embankment way off in the distance. The fight was over. Paul lay there unconscious and quiet, no more kicking. Finally, Billy could get the satchel. Chapter 30. Satchel. He awoke. His arms were tied, and his feet were also. He lay along the coldness of the earth. Paul could see the tiny blood vials. They weren't in his satchel. "You son of a bitch!" he blatantly screamed towards Billy. "I need them. They are mine." He continued as he struggled. The vials were small and lined up along the top of a rotten log. Billy had placed them there. He had questions for Paul as he thought to himself about the bizarre blood-filled vials. It was weird to him. Billy knew it had to be important. It had to do with something, but what? He asked himself as he peered towards Paul. Billy only had 3 words to ask him as he walked towards the glass vials sitting there. "What are they?" he asked, sounding demanding, hoping Paul would succumb. Paul spit at him, missing his shoe by an inch. "Do you think I would tell you?" he asked Billy. Billy was cold again, noticing something behind Paul was lurking. His eyes got big. The greenish mist was back. The one he had seen the night before on the street. It was floating in the distance just behind some trees. Billy could see Paul wasn't going to surrender. He wasn't going to help him. It just wasn't who he was. He opened the satchel in front of Paul, collecting the vials of blood as they accumulated within it. Paul's face turned red. The cold didn't seem to be affecting him as bad as Billy. As Billy held the satchel, all the vials rattled, creating a clinking sound. Paul just looked on at him, with death in his eyes and face. Billy looked down at him. "You're staying put until you tell me what these things are for." Paul spit, turned his head to the side, and spit blood from his mouth. Billy noticed he was bleeding and knew it must have been from the scuffle. Paul sat there calmer now, but didn't talk. He looked as if he was thinking. Billy tossed the satchel closer to Paul. He had a plan in his mind that given minute. He was curious of the blood inside the strange vials. What were they for, he wondered to himself. He knew if he played with Paul's emotions, just maybe he could get him to talk. He walked towards him. Paul looked exhausted from rolling around, and the exertion must have caused him. He looked red, but this time it wasn't out of anger. It looked as if the cold was finally in him as he stayed there tied with broken vines Billy found after knocking Paul senseless. Paul could see the satchel was almost in his reach. He tried using his shoe to pull it in by its strap. He couldn't get it around, though. It was just out of his way as it lay there on top of a small pile of wild grass. Billy took a couple steps, reaching the satchel, leaning over and picking it up in his hand as he held it in front of Paul's face. As Billy looked down at him, he could see Paul's eyes were fighting inside not to lose his cool. "I'll tell you what. I can see it's not that important to you, or you would have told me already about the blood." Billy continued talking. "One last time I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to smash the fucking vials." Billy made sure he sounded as demanding as he felt. Paul flapped around on the cold ground, trying to break out from the restraints Billy had put around his legs and arms moment before. Billy watched him. As he chuckled, he looked like a dolphin caught up in one of those tuna nets. Paul then suddenly stopped fighting. "It's for my parents. They have a rare condition, that's why I have the blood." Paul looked at him and closed his eyes after talking. He seemed sincere. Billy crouched down and sat on the log where he had the vials earlier. "What kind of condition? Why do they need the blood? Where did you get it?" Billy asked, not exactly understanding. Paul still had his eyes closed. Opening them, he said to him, "I'll show you, if you get these off of me. The vines are cutting into me. I promise I won't run again." Billy stood, shaking his head, although he debated within himself. He sat up from the log, still holding the satchel. He examined it once more as he lightly placed it to his side. Paul was watching in desperation and still worming and moving around in the holds. Billy pulled himself up from where he sat and went over towards Paul, carrying the strange purse he believed to be a satchel. He dropped it on to Paul as he became still, then reached down and started to undo the vines holding him. "If you run, I'll catch you. And this time I'm going to put you in a coma. Do you hear me?" he said, still getting the final parts of the knot undone on Paul's legs. "I hear you loud and clear. I just want these off." Seconds later, while lifting himself up from the ground. Chapter 31, Mission Against Evil. Bandaged and laying, she laid there as she watched a small hand on the clock turn over as Roger came in to greet her. She had been sleeping for hours, and outside it was starting to flurry. Billie Jean watched a window in a small room from the bed. It didn't make sense to her, but seeing it brought back a feeling she hadn't had in years. Roger leaned down, giving her a tiny kiss on her forehead. Her fevers were in order, and they didn't seem to be coming back anytime soon. Lily tried turning over as gentle as she could to see Roger better as she lay there. She was burnt badly and could feel the burns from underneath the bandages. It felt like they were starting to boil. The pain was extremely irritating for her as she inched her body to see him. Roger looked exhausted. His face was unshaven and his hair was sticking up in the back. Lily took notice. Roger had brought in some healing ointment for her burning arms. As she smiled at him, Roger seemed very genuine. "I brought you this, darling," he said, looking at her with the warm twinkle in his eyes. "It should help you heal up. My grandmother turned me into it a few years back. When I got badly burned while at camp with my brothers, I was just a kid then, but damn, she knew what she was talking about when it came to medicine," Roger said as he reached over to lightly hold Lily's bruised fingers. Lily smiled, thinking about the story he had told her as he began telling her more. "My grandmother had about every brand name of medicine you could imagine. If you've seen it, her bathroom was just as stacked up with pill bottles as the drug pharmacy," he finished while still holding on to her tiny fingers. Lily gave his fingers a light squeeze back, letting him know she appreciated him and all he has done. She never had anyone take care of her in that way, other than her mother and her father. Roger sat there for a while in the wooden chair beside Lily and watched her as she became sleepy and started to look heavy-eyed. He looked up at the silver-rimmed clock hanging on the wall. Afternoon had come and went, passing quickly as he stood up to leave. Before walking out from the room, he yawned and took another peek back at Lily. She was sound asleep and seemed to be having a dream as she spoke in her rest. He turned back around, leaving her alone. Lily was standing in the aisle of the plane as it flew through the open skies. She didn't know where she was heading. She had never flown before. The small town of Mansfield was the only place she had really been other than going out of state for some of the horse races she entered. The plane was flying steady and she could see other people there sitting in their seats as she stood. She didn't see an empty seat to sit in, and in the distance she noticed some of the passengers were standing as well, but by the pilot's door. The door was shut. It was as if they were guarding it for some reason, or maybe waiting for somebody to come out. The plane was riding smoothly through the whiteness of the sky still as she peered out from another window where a couple was sitting. Both of them were also staring out from the same window, and hadn't noticed Lily there standing. Lily Jean walked towards the men in robes. They were just up ahead at the front of the plane. She was only half the way to them. One of them was holding a red scarf of some sort as Lily cautiously walked closer, not having a seat to sit in. She wasn't scared, yet she felt compelled to come closer to them. They were standing facing her. One of the men was standing by the left side of the pilot's bay, and the other one was on the other side. As she walked suddenly at an instant, she stopped there as she turned her eyes to the right side of her. Befuddled and confused, her face turned white as she peered into her eyes. It was a little girl from the house, the one that disappeared. She was staring back at Lily, and she looked curious of her. Lily stood in silence, just peering into her beautiful brown eyes, as the little girl gave her a swift smile while holding her teddy bear. Lily's heart was warmer now. She knew the little girl was okay wherever they were. She began to wonder where she actually was and asked herself if she was still in Mansfield. Lily walked again, passing by the little girl she had seen once before, still wanting to talk to the men up ahead. As she approached the pilot's cockpit area where the door was still closed, a sudden light shined in from the window as she turned around to see behind her. She noticed it was every window that had the blinding beam shining in as if the plane had hit the sun. In that very moment, the door from within the pilot swung open by itself, and the same blinding beam of brilliant light came flying towards her as she shielded her eyes in wonder. As she shielded herself from it, she could see two men standing inside the pilot area, but the light was powerful and made it hard to see very well as she continued walking towards it. The light began to dissipate, but still shined behind a man coming out. The other one stood behind him in the golden light, waving towards Lily, but she could only see his arm, and it looked as if he had a white robe on as well, but she wasn't certain as she watched. Afterward, the door closed softly shut, again by itself, leaving behind the other man. She could only see the little spots in her eyes from the blinding light as the unknown figure began to approach her in the aisle. Lily's face lit up as the spots began to leave her. She stood frozen in awe and couldn't believe her eyes as he stood there smiling back. He was wearing the white robe as well, and also had his one hand clasped around something inside of the robe. Lily was unsure of what it was as she took notice while looking back at him. His face was as she remembered, and he looked even healthier and more holy as she took a long look in exhilaration at her father. He then pulled his hand from the pocket of the robe he wore, pulling out something as he raised his hand from his pocket. He touched her face with his free hand and looked deeply into her tearful eyes. "You will need this," he said with a strong look of confidence at her. "It will be all I can do." She looked at him, awaiting what he had for her. "Let it guide you in your journey," he said while placing the tiny object into her hand. He pressed her hand shut around it before she could look. "I love you always, and remember I'm always with you," he said, cracking a gentle smile while turning back towards the pilot's cockpit area. As he walked, he was receding into the light. Chapter 32, Home of the Unknown. Both of the boys arrived back by Shaw Road, arriving on the porch outside of Paul's house. Paul seemed to be keeping up his end of the bargain as he followed him into his house. Entering the first room, it was the kitchen, and things looked to be a total disaster. Billy thought as he walked in following him. The table was piled high with expired canned food and boxes of fruit that looked rotten. The cabinet doors beneath the kitchen counters were open and hanging. Things looked ignored and forgotten as if nobody had lived there. Billy continued to follow Paul, wondering about what he had said earlier, when he told him about his parents needing the blood vials. Paul's house was dark, and all of the windows were covered with dark curtains which kept almost all of the sun out. It was cold inside as well. As they continued walking, Billy could feel the weird chill that had almost overcome him, but he didn't say anything to Paul of it as he followed along. He knew not to trust Paul after what had just occurred in the woods just behind their house. The stairs turned and went even higher to the second floor where Paul was taking him to see his parents. The dark corners worried Billy of what could be lurking in the unfamiliar rundown home. Billy followed cautiously behind, wondering if Paul was plotting something or planning some type of escape. Reaching the top of the stairs, there was 2 rooms directly across from each other, and both had their doors shut. It seemed to be quiet to Billy as he stood in anticipation of Paul's needful parents. Paul stopped in front of the door, turning his head towards Billy as he stood just behind. He didn't say anything, but he looked as if he was feeling guilty or against his beliefs bringing Billy there. He clutched the door handle and turned it slowly as it slid open, swinging open while making a distinct sound of needing repaired. Walking in, Paul went to the other side of the room where an ancient canopy bed sit. It looked as if they had stepped into a nightmare. The scene was disturbing and hard to bear for Billy as he coughed into his hand, watching from the door. Both of his parents were laying on top of a blue tarp that had been laid there to cover the mattress underneath. They were laying on top of it and had plastic wrapping encasing them in together. They were rolled up together as if they were a frozen dinner waiting to be nuked. Billy was speechless as he watched. Paul was now kneeling against the bed with his knee as he bent over. He checked in what seemed to be his mother's pulse on her arm hanging out from the plastic wrap. A vulgar smell had hit Billy as he stood by the doorway, distancing himself from the scene of Paul's parents. The walls of the room had blood smeared onto them as if a young child had been practicing his finger painting. Billy could see the blood as he traced the walls, as if he was doodling in an activity book doing a dot to dot. More of the tiny vials were sitting along an old unused radiator along the floor, but they were cleaned out and dry of blood as Billy took the room in a while. He waited for Paul to get up from the bedside. There was a syringe laying by the bed as well, and a half-empty bottle of rubbing alcohol by it. What was Paul doing here? Billy wondered, feeling obscure. Why was Paul concealing his parents to such a life, instead of finding help for them? But then again, there wasn't any help now. The town was gone. Billy continued to watch Paul as he whispered into his father's ear. He couldn't hear what was being said other than hearing his name within the low conversation. Billy could see his parents breathing, but it looked shallow and faint. Why did he wrap them up the way he did? He questioned himself inside of his head. Suddenly, Paul stood up from where he was and walked towards the other end of the room where there was a closet. The closet was shut and had a large sliding door covering it. Billy felt more attentive now and stepped towards Paul as he slid it open to retrieve something. A foot or two away, Billy stood still behind, awaiting, as Paul came back out from within it holding a shotgun. Billy quickly backed away as Paul looked at him briskly, raising the barrel towards Billy's face. He was seething but hadn't cocked it yet. They stood eye to eye just briefly. As Billy swiveled, twirling his body quickly, making his way back outside of Paul's parents' master bedroom, he aggressively hurtled towards the glass window, running as rapidly as he could as Paul opened fire with the double barrel towards Billy. Billy vaulted himself into the glass, instantly impacting through it, falling from the second story of the old window. His jump was accurately timed as he landed onto the frozen ground below, but his leg was burning of high hell. Pieces of the buckshot had fragmented into him, and he was bleeding from it. Paul was at the window from above, holding the sight of the long-barreled shotgun aimed at Billy, holding the trigger with his finger pressed against it, but he didn't shoot again. Billy could see him as he fought his leg to move, but the pain was too extreme and felt like a million knives had just stuck into him and were still chopping into it. Paul left the window as he watched and wondered if he was coming down to shoot him again like a dying deer. He grabbed onto his bleeding leg where it had been hit with shrapnel of the blast. He was hit low and figured Paul had just missed the main artery. A second or two later, he heard from the front door, just across from where he lay. It opened and then shut. He couldn't see who it was, but if he put his money on it, he would say it was Paul again. He turned to look around, detecting Paul standing over him with the large pitted rock. Before he could react, Paul had pummeled him in the head with it, leaving him bleeding and cold, and near death. Chapter 33, Journey Against All Odds. She was laying still when she awoke from the strange plane, the one her father had come to see her in. The one she had also seen a little girl sitting with her teddy bear. She now believed the little girl to be deceased. Was it a plane of the ones who had passed on, she wondered? Or was it just another vivid dream she was playing out inside her imagination? Whatever the dream was, it seemed to have a code within it. One that could change the coldness, maybe even kill it. kill it the same way it has done to the town of Mansfield. At least she hoped it. Something spiritual had seemed to take over her while she slept. Something unusual, and had no words to explain it. The bedroom was silent, and it seemed to be just her there. Roger wasn't with her now. She wondered if he had fallen asleep in the other room or possibly upstairs. She was laying on her back now. It was something she never did, and her hands were placed neatly over the top of her chest, the saddle on her chest forming almost a cross. She didn't move yet and could still feel the pain of her burns in her forearms. She desperately needed to get to the bathroom but hasn't moved since she awoke to see Roger much earlier. It was hurting and she wasn't going to be able to hold it for much longer. She wasn't even sure if she could get herself undressed enough to go without having Roger's help. It made her think as she lay there. It wasn't something she really felt all that comfortable with, but if it came down to it, she had to. Instantly, as she lay there, she noticed something was in her hand, still closed in her fingers as if she had to protect it with her life. What could it be? She pondered to herself, hesitating to open it, but remembering her father in her dream had given her something just a moment before she awoke. Could it be? Could it be the same object he handed her there as they flew through the open sky in the plain where dead people continued journeying until it's the day of judgment? She thought a second, then opened her fingers from it. To her amazement, it was the horse. The glass horse and the cowboy riding with his hat lifted and waving. How the... She thought, staring at it as if she was still that little girl she was when her father had given it to her. How in the world did I get this? She questioned herself yet again, holding on to it, ignoring her burning arms. Why was it that important? What was he talking about when he said my journey? All those questions were running through her brain like a ball of lettuce running through a blender. Holding the tiny glass horse, she had it in her fingers as she looked at it. She was disoriented. Turning it around in her hands as the light from the window shined from it, it seemed almost to her as if the tiny object had some sort of power. What kind of power? She didn't know, but she felt mesmerized by it as she held it there. It had something to do with the coldness. She thought about it for a little as she lay on her back awaiting Roger to come in soon. At least she figured he would be back any time now that it was getting later. The warmth of the fire was burning and he could feel it along his cold, wet body. As he bleed, he opened his eyes to see the fire just inches from the rock he was hit with. How long have I been out? He wondered to himself, laying there on the snowy surface. He's been out cold, but wasn't sure how it happened and his head was hurting. It was bleeding down into his face. Some of it had reached his mouth as he wiped it away. He wasn't sure. He couldn't think straight and knew he was severely injured. He knew it was by the hands of Paul. He could hear Paul poking the fire. It sounded like he was using a stick to do it. The fire wasn't much, but it was beginning to warm his legs a bit. The pain was starting to numb a little from the snowy ground. He couldn't get up. His leg was caught badly from the shot blast, but managed to turn himself, noticing Paul a foot away by the fire. He still had that stupid satchel with him around the shoulder. Paul was standing over the burning fire as he took a small box cutter blade from his pocket. Billy lay there wondering if he was going to use it on him. He hoped to himself that Paul was just going to use it to carve the stick or something, but as he held the blade, he pulled his other arm out in front of it, rolling his sleeve up. Billy's eyes widened as he watched the odd boy. Paul then dug the box cutter blade deep into his arm as blood began to pour from him. Billy screamed over to him. "What the hell is wrong with you? I knew you were sick when I seen you the first time, kid." Paul looked on as he pushed the blade even further into his arm. As he reached towards the satchel, opening it as it hung on to him with his other hand, he dropped the bloody-edged blade onto the ground as he unzipped it and took one of those funny little vials from it. As his blood began to gush out, he held it underneath the one he stuck with the blade. It was now filling into it as he held it there. Billy tried to sit up, but his leg was too wounded. He watched Paul concentrating on his every move. As Paul finished filling the first vial, he grabbed a second and began to squeeze his gashed arm to get more blood from it. Again, Billy screamed towards Paul. "Why do you need the blood? Tell me. It's not like you're going to let me live." Paul finally acknowledged him as he lay there holding on to his left leg. Oh, you will see. You would definitely see." He then began to laugh, a sinister laugh. Paul then put the vials into the strange satchel and closed it. The satchel already seemed to have blood on it. Whose blood? He didn't know. Paul then walked over to Billy as he lay there on the frozen earth. The fire was beginning to burn itself out, as Paul grabbed onto Billy's good leg, the one that wasn't injured. Billy screamed as he jerked his leg, trying to pull him further into the heavy wooded area. His cut leg was agonizing and in pain. Just then, Paul took his leg, gripping it tight as he could, and planted his boots as deep as they would go. The traction was tough now, as he attempted once again to pull Billy. Billy was face down now as Paul held on to him as he forced away. Billy screamed, yet he didn't budge him. Billy was bleeding even more now from the attempt. "Damn you motherfucker, you're dead weight," he cried to Billy as he lay there almost passing out from the pain and his blood loss. Paul stopped trying while still holding his leg and his arm. His arm was still bleeding from the self-inflicted cut he did a moment earlier with the box cutter. He stood there looking around, and then again as he stared back towards his house. Billy was holding his bloody leg with the other in Paul's hand. Just then Paul dropped Billy and said, "Don't go anywhere, I'll be back for you." Billy could tell he wasn't right in his head. Something was missing in there. He didn't care to find out either. But where was Paul going, he thought. He could see Paul moving through the trees that led to his house. He didn't seem to be in the biggest hurry. Billy hoped he wouldn't be back anytime soon, knowing he wouldn't get up from the ground. It seemed like an hour had passed as Billy lay there. Suddenly, he could hear the sound of some type of machine running from in the distance. He wondered what it was. He couldn't see anyone coming his way or coming from the heavy brush in the direction of Paul's house. A few minutes later, he heard it again, getting closer, and then he could see it. It was coming his way, and Paul was with it. It was riding on something, but Billy couldn't see well enough what it was as he lay there behind the heavy brush of woods. As he got closer, Paul rode onto the lane near the camp area where he had started the fire. Billy watched as he came towards him, not knowing what his intent was, holding his leg still as the noise got closer to his face. Paul slowed it and pulled the old rusted tractor beside Billy as he lay there in torment. Paul climbed down from the tractor as he grabbed something from behind its seat. He carried a yellow and white braided rope over towards Billy as he watched in wonder. "Looks like you're going for a ride," Paul said, looking down at Billy as he lay in agony. Billy didn't say anything, clenching his teeth from the pain his leg was causing him. Paul went over to Billy's leg again and tied the rope around his good leg, as Billy almost lost his consciousness as he screamed, "Please don't do this. I'm pleading to you. I don't deserve this. Why? Please." Paul started the tractor, leaving Billy tied and ready, as he stomped it, dragging Billy across the frozen, icy ground, smashing his leg and body against the rocky path. He could barely scream as the pain shoot from his leg and up to his back, bleeding more with every bump and the constant gravelly patches passing underneath him. His eyes would close every time his leg smacked into another icy mound of coldness and debris. Paul got him and the tractor up into another part of the trails where he stopped it and turned the key off. Billy was still on his stomach and had lacerations across him that were wet, dampened, and beginning to shed tiny driplets of blood. Billy picked his head up enough to see an old car half dug into the dirt. The Ford was starting to frost over, too. He was out of breath from being dragged and had lost a great amount of blood and torn flesh. Paul got down from the tractor as his boots hit the frozen land. He walked over towards Billy, laying there in critical condition. He grabbed Paul by the left leg, lifting it up to loosen the knot around it. Billy screamed again, "You son of a bitch! Where are you taking me?" Paul didn't say anything as he got the knot off from him. As his leg fell from the tractor, it hit the ground bluntly, causing Billy to bite his lip, as blood filled his mouth and ran into his teeth. Paul went around towards Billy's face as he reached down yet again and grabbed him by the back of his collar, lifting his head away from the icy surface. He forced Billy to the side, making him look over along the trail. There was a huge tree that had fallen, blocking the path. Billy didn't see anything else, as Paul pointed out to him. "Look over there, you idiot. You're toast. This is where I wait for them to come. You thought you were smart, but I'm smarter than you, jackass." The tent was covered over quickly and camouflaged with broken tree branches, bark, and frozen leaves to hide it from the trail and anyone else's view. Billy wondered why. Billy lay there thinking, unsure of Paul's comment. What do you mean, they?" he asked, confused and in the pain he felt as he bled into the ground where the tractor had stopped moments before. Chapter 34, Preacher. Lily Jean had to pull herself up. She took the glass horse and rider and carefully put it in her top jean pocket, trying hard not to bump her sore arms. Roger must have fallen asleep or stepped out for the time being, Lily thought to herself laying there. She was sore and her arms were wrapped and bandaged, but she couldn't stand another minute laying in that bed. The springs were beginning to poke, and every time she tried to get comfortable again, another would stick her. Her boots were folded nice and neat on the wooden chair, and her hooded sweatshirt was also. He must have washed it for her, she realized as she smiled. Most people in Mansfield didn't have a washer or dryer. They used the well water from outside and hung-dried their clothes. Roger must have done it after finding her there at the pub after it burnt to the floor. Ashes and cinder was all that was left. She was sure of that. She thought about it as it all came back to her. Debating on whether to get up and fight the burn she had or call for Roger, she decided to do it on her own. That's what she was known for, to be a hard-nosed country girl. She knew getting up now would mean she's going to have to start her own personal rehab the minute she takes off to bed. It was time. Roger wasn't up, or maybe he was. She didn't know. As she scooted towards the edge of the bed, she inched over until she reached the very lip of the mattress. She leaned her right leg off from it and proceeded to turn onto it with her body until she landed both legs on the ground, doing everything not to hit those burned arms of hers. Her adrenaline got her out of that God-forbidden bed, and it was enough to get her moving. She then slowly crept towards the door. Once she got into the next room, which was the living room, she didn't see Roger. She called out to him. "Roger, are you there?" She didn't see or hear him, so she called out for a second time, hoping she didn't have to go upstairs. "Roger, I'm up. I had to. I couldn't stand another moment laying down in there," she said aloud. As she went towards the bathroom, the door was closed as she neared it. She grasped the knob, turning it, and she could hear the faint sound of somebody. There's somebody inside, and water was running, but she wasn't positive it was Roger. "Roger, are you in there?" she asked, but didn't get a reply. She peeked inside, holding the door halfway open with one hand, trying not to see anything unattractive, closing her eyes as she called him. "Roger." Roger didn't answer her, as she grew queer, peeking her head in further. This time, she had her eyes open as she looked. She could see somebody in the shower. The silhouette was moving around as if they were getting washed up under the shower head. She walked in. Coming all the way in from the door, she stooped in front of the sink as she looked at her face in the mirror. "Roger, I had to get up out of there. Had to get up off the bed. It was killing me being in there," she said to him. "Roger, do you hear me?" Still standing at the mirror, looking at her raw face, she noticed the exposure from the cold had chafed her skin. Roger still had not answered her. She tucked her bottom lip under her top teeth in frustration, wondering if he was intentionally disregarding her for some odd, off-the-wall reason. She turned from the aged mirror and was now facing the shower. She could still see he was still in there scouring himself, wondering why he wasn't paying her any attention. She walked over and grasped the curtain and started to pull it back, peeling it towards her as she could see his legs. The watering was sopping from them as it hit the tub below. She was hesitant to look any further. She really didn't want to see any further up his body. "Roger," she said, but receiving no reply. Suddenly, the silhouette from behind the curtain vaulted out at her. Frightened, peeking his head out, jumping back out of pure reflex and spilling backwards onto the floor, landing on her backside, peering upwards. It was Roger. He still had his head out from the running stream of searing water drizzling down on him. "Roger, are you okay?" she asked, concerned over the freakish setting. He glared at her from within the shower and hastily put it back behind the curtain and continued cleansing. She looked puzzled as she got up from the moistened bathroom floor. Okay," she said, murmuring under her breath, getting ready to walk out. "Yeah, I'm all right. I'm just freshening up for the brethren." She looked briskly back towards the shower stall, looking puzzled. "What?" She was unclear what he meant by it, but he didn't answer back this time. Deciding to vacate, she left the room and walked towards the main door, wanting to inspect the weather outside. Opening the main door, she could see it was flurrying now, and the wind was starting to billow and gust as it came in her direction, hitting her at the door. She was still inside looking out. Unexpectedly, Roger came around from the side of the house, carrying a canister of fuel. "How did you get there?" Lily asked him, gaping at him, utterly confused. "What do you mean? I've been out here for an hour. Had to get the generator going," he said, peering back at her with a witty look upon his face. "No, you weren't. I just seen you," she said hastily, but the thought of him inside was becoming more hazy now. "Seen me where? Inside?" he quickly asked, looking more dazed by her questions the more they chattered. "Yes, you were just in the shower, weren't you?" she asked him immediately back. He was still standing there with the canister of fuel, looking cold as he brushed some of the wet ice from his neck. "Yes," she said, turning back into the doorway. She rushed back towards where she had seen him. She broke through the door as it swung into the wall behind it. The shower was still streaming and she could still see someone inside. Hesitating to approach the shower yet again, Roger wasn't in there. She had just seen him. Who could be in there? She contemplated in terror. She stayed crouched as she came inches from the shower curtain, waiting impulsively to open it. Suddenly she reached to grab the plastic liner and the curtain all at once, hastily ripping it open. Her heart spiked, sending her nerves jumping through the roof. The dread was so great and alarming inside she almost crawled out of her own skin. She acknowledged the man as he crawled out onto his hands and knees onto the floor, leaving puddles of melting flesh from his hands as he wriggled towards her. He sprung up at her, clasping her around her shoulders with both fleshy hands. Her body erupted convulsively, nearly collapsing as she stood there looking at him in horror. "Go now. Go to the woods by Montgomery High." His voice was piercing and full of emotion, and his face was malformed and repulsive as she stood frozen, unable to move. Roger bolted into the bathroom. The door was open already as he could see Lily standing there alone. "I will, but why?" she cried, as tears began to drip from her face. The shock was great and had her standing there still repeating herself. "Why, though?" she asked, as Roger took her by her hand, leading her back into the living room to sit her down. He didn't know what else to do. This time it wasn't her father. It wasn't the little dead girl from the plane. It wasn't the frozen people from the pub. It was Sam Wright, the pastor from the local church, the Christian Church of God. She sat there with her head down, thinking, still in tears from seeing the manifestation of the man she knew little of, but had seen him a few times outside of his farm, cutting his lawn or planting flower beds. Why was he an apparition? Was her imagination, she wondered? Or was he dead and sending her a warning to fight against the coldness? She didn't understand what he meant. Why her? She questioned herself. Her faith wasn't as great as some. At least she thought it that way as she sat there with Roger in the other room now. He was getting her some pills to mellow her out. He knew she was under a lot of stress and duration. Chapter 35, Fire and Devils. It was absolutely the coldest night of them all, and the intensity of the flames wasn't warming Billy Jones. There was no distinction between the fire and just resting on the coldness of hell. A few hours before he was dragged again, but this time he was left by the tent Paul had thoroughly concealed, masking it away from anyone who might come nearby and ask questions. The same kind of questions he needed answered. Paul was camping inside the tent, and he could see him from the outside, where he had been left by a thin tree uprooted from within the uneven ground. He watched as Paul sat inside mumbling to himself. Billy didn't know what he was whispering, but it didn't sound rational. It sounded quite unstable. Billy knew the bird had flown from its coop, and time would be the answer if he would ever regain any normality. A small iron pot was boiling over the fire just feet away from Billy's dying leg. His head was bleeding, but not as bad. He couldn't see it, and hoped it didn't need stitches as he lay against the narrow tree. In the pot was some soup Paul had brought from his house. Billy was hurting badly and was having trouble staying awake from the lack of anything to drink. He had those candy bars at the school, but that was a long while ago. He knew he wouldn't make them much longer outside in the cold. Paul was still inside. Billy wondered if Paul was planning on ending him or if he had any other malicious plans for him. As he sat now up against the tree, he began to peel some of his jeans back and examine the wound caused by the buckshot. It was bad. Real bad. Black blood was beginning to drain slowly from his leg. He hoped it wouldn't become infected, and it was only a matter of time before he would go into shock. And they were out in the trails. Who could help him? He knew the reality that nobody was coming. A quick minute had passed as Paul unzipped the tent he was in and came out to check if the soup was warm yet, as he stirred it with a broken twig. He stopped and went walking back to his open tent and swiftly came right back out again, this time holding a small plastic bowl. Billy hadn't seen him with it earlier and wasn't sure how he'd gotten it. Billy watched from afar. Paul was unloading the hot soup into the bowl. It was pitch dark now, late evening, and the sun seemed to die low quicker that night. Still unable to get up and run, Billy sat there awaiting death, hoping there wouldn't be any wild animals out that night. If there was, he would certainly be their dinner with an open leg and bloody flesh hanging from it. Paul was making his way over to Billy with the bowl. He didn't know what he was planning as he approached him. Billy didn't even bother looking up at him as he came to a sudden stop just inches from his face, crouching down so he could see face to face with him. "Consider this your last dinner. Oh, and before you eat, let me spice it up for you, jerk-off," he said, as he held the bowl in front of Billy. He then began to clear his throat, bringing deep mucus into his mouth, then steadily blew it into the soup. Billy turned his head to the side in disgust. He was revolted by Paul. "Keep it. I'm dead already from what you're saying," he said back to Paul while trying to kick the bowl over into the ground. Paul picked it back up before he could spill it from the bowl and placed it a few feet away. "In case you change your mind," he said. Billy Jones sat there all night, fearing for his life as he bled in the cold. The trickling blood in his leg had began to sedate until it completely bubbled over and hardened, looking more like a freezer-burned ice pop after falling out the box than an actual leg. Gangrene was developing within his leg, and the pain would have been fatal if he hadn't fallen asleep when he did. Billy's head gently sloped against the tree as he dozed into the darkness of his own fabricated world where the darkness couldn't touch him. Paul walked leisurely back to his tent, zipping himself in for the night. A stretch of time had passed by as the evening turned inky and much more darker. Paul was inside of the secret tent that he had concealed and hidden out of the sight from others who might stumble onto the path and catch the two boys. He was woken abruptly by a swift coldness that immediately unfurled itself as it circulated and penetrated through the tent, although it was fastened shut. Paul murmured to himself, half asleep, "Damn, it's getting cold. Mom, can you give me another blanket?" Thinking he was still at home, although he wasn't. He wasn't even close. And he was outside, awaiting the coldness and awaiting something that words could not describe. He was suddenly astounded, realizing it was there now. His eyes opened almost the same way a young child would after realizing it was Christmas morning. The raucous cold had been initiating itself around the boys' camp. Paul suddenly leaped to his feet, searching for his boots. Putting them on hastily, he unzipped the tent and hurried over towards Billy Jones, who had fallen into a paralyzed sleep state. Billy was suffering a plodding death and was struggling to breathe as Paul stood looking downwards at him. "Wake up now," he said. But Billy didn't respond. "The coldness is here, and you're going. Even if I can't wake your sorry ass," he shouted at him. While reaching towards Billy's already decaying leg, he could see the pus frozen along his rip-saturated jeans where he had shot him with the shotgun hours earlier. It was a gruesome sight, but didn't bother him the least. Paul continued to dig one of his fingers into Billy's rancid injury. Still, Billy Jones lay against the tree as if death had already thieved his ultimate desire to stay alive. His eyes were gluing from the jarring wind and coldness it conveyed surrounding the two boys in the thick wooded area where they camped. He was there, but his body was dying as Paul muttered to himself, "I knew I should have taxed your blood the way I did Jimmy's father," Paul said quietly. Although Billy didn't hear him as he lay lifeless and breathing faintly. "They're not going to take you like this," Paul said as he licked his finger. Not the one that he had used on Billy's leg, but another as he tried to pinpoint. Coldness felt the greatest. From within a far distance he could see something almost swirling in the sky above the woods. The wind above was conspiring, almost forming a luminescent light within the cold air just above the frosted trees. It was unquestionable. It was the opening he had been waiting for. The unexplainable coldness blew into Paul, hitting him as he stood before Billy's motionless, immobile anatomy. His body looked now more like a pyramid of saturated blood and flesh. The coarse, angry winds were glacial as they unrolled, like how the tides rise momentarily, briefly, before a colossal tsunami strikes. Paul given up on Billy as his futile body lay against the tree. "I'll just have to explain to them," he said, briskly, running back into the tent for the satchel. He left Billy Jones there to be forsaken, for death to liberate him as he were. He walked hastily towards the rapturous ring just yards away, shifting in the sky above and just a few yards from the back of his house. The unwelcoming cold carried Paul as if he was weightless and wrenching him towards the unearthly ring as it sheamed downwards almost to ground level. His legs were moving, but he had no authority of himself as he neared the opening in the air. Immediately perforating the obtuse ring leading to the unimaginable, he dissolved into the force of darkness. Billy Jones, on the far side of the woodland, lay against the tree that second, opened both of his crusted eyelids as he extended his jaded arm, reaching into his pocket to convey the tiny eagle he had found. The one from the abandoned farmhouse where he had found it. The same one that reminded him of his dead father. The same eagle that had shepherded him to finding forgiveness of his father's suicide. His breathing was sluggish and sedated and beginning to fail him, as he gazed, admiring the tiny object that had brought him so far. Just then, his breathing had ceased as he perished into kingdom come. An astute hour had passed since the coldness had opened itself and taken Paul as well as Billy Jones, but in a different way. A way in which this seemed more civilized. The world that Paul had entered was unknown and wicked, and wasn't something man was able to grasp or understand. The dimension that had taken control of the town had no laws within it. Those thousands of unanswered inquiries that would be left unsaid. But who really had the answers? It was unexplainable and would stay that way until it decided on its own terms to absent from the tiny forgotten town of Mansfield. It's almost as if fate had arrived there for what it was, is what it seemed. Just above Billy Jones as he lay along the pitted path against his final resting spot, the most bizarre serendipity had occurred. Something beautiful and alluring had just flown over him, steep above the mountains surrounding him and just slightly above the frozen treetops. A bald eagle glided gradually over him, just above him as if it were somebody he knew visiting him one last time before saying goodbye. Or maybe it was just a reincarnation of himself in some extraordinary way. On the other side of Mansfield, Lily Jean had never left Rogers that day. She was too fearful of what was to come. The outcome was too great of a risk to her. She sat there with Roger while he drank another beer at her side. He was sloshed, and although she never went to the trail Sam Wright had commanded her to go to, she felt okay with her decision. Her journey was just beginning.